Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring Dystopias, Volume 2. The Last Class by Richard Banks. Bright Islands by Frank Riley. Inhibition by James Causey. The Happy Clown by Alice Eleanor Jones. I, Executioner by Ted White and Terry Carr. The Last Class by Richard Banks. Originally published in Amazing Stories, July 1962. Narrated by Tom Trussel. "And now, children," said Miss Hippiness, her smile shooting deep wrinkles across her face like the cracks up the scarred sides of the ancient, empty skyscrapers of New York. The 12 children in the cozy classroom came to attention. It was not her words, it was the tone, the creaking smile. "And now, children," said Miss Hippiness again, sitting down on the old-fashioned straight chair she affected. "Have you all put away your atomic blocks?" "Yes, teacher," came the chorus of sweet young voices. "Your electronic jackstraws, your pencil monastics?" "Yes, teacher." "And have you all put the pretty little activator pills in your mouths?" They nodded. Miss Hippiness raised her hand for silence. 30 dear, dear seconds, children," she said. A sigh of pleasure suddenly smoked up from the 12 young faces as the pills took effect, and they remembered. "Poor little darlings, to be so terribly fooled," said Miss Hippiness to herself. If it was only possible for them to remember this part of the day, outside, and not to have it blacked out by the pills half an hour from now. To remember this part of the day, above all other parts, on into adulthood. What a different world they would create. "So we come to the nice part of our day," she said. "We are going to talk again about the 20th century. The children fidgeted in pleasure. She had turned on the sun 5 minutes ago, and its beams through the window highlighted the youngness, the eagerness of their faces, turned so trustingly to her. Here and there the sunlight flashed silver glints, for instance, on the tiny identification discs, smaller than 20th century dimes in their foreheads, and half hidden in the hairlines where they were inset in each person nowadays at birth. A small hand shot up. "Yes?" said Miss Hippiness. "Can we talk about the gangsters?" Mary asked. Another small hand jerked up eagerly. "Yes?" said Miss Hippiness. "Can we talk about wars and bombs and things?" Henry asked. Miss Hippiness beamed on them. Children, she scolded in fake sternness. "Of course we can. But we've talked about them all so often. Isn't there something else you'd rather hear?" The little hand sprouted like fast weeds. Miss Hippiness! She was called Miss Hippiness, even to her face now, and she didn't dislike it. Somewhere inside her the name had begun to give out a pulsing warmth like a tiny real sun. 50 years ago she would have disintegrated any child who would have dared to call her such a name. Her eyes flicked at the disintegrator, still standing in its corner opposite the matter transmitter. But it was a dusty, dirty old thing. She hadn't used it in years. At home, she still had the hair ribbon. They had been in style briefly that year among certain types of families. The last little girl had been wearing the day she had walked so defiantly into the disintegrator. More frequently, the last year or so, Miss Hippiness had been troubled by nightmares in which the little girl's face peppered everything. Strange. She didn't remember the faces of those other children she had forced to march into the machine. But then, she had been much younger in those days, so much more a part of this contemporary world, And of course, that was before she had begun delving so avidly into history. Miss Hippiness had been teaching the first grade in the same school, Official Learning Dome 111, called Old 111, for almost 60 years, and she had been a great teacher. She had never been a really large woman or a fat one. It was just that she tended to massiveness in the one part of her anatomy, and 10 years ago she had let the massiveness really bloom. Never again had she given in to the pressures of fashion in a world where hips and breasts came and went on women like hemlines of the 20th century. The 20th century. Miss Hippiness let a dreaminess invade her eyes. "Children," she said in her fond voice, "the 20th century has never been duplicated. It stands unique in history. Think of the richness of that far age when a person could actually choose what he was going to do in life, and where there were still hunger and sickness and want and wars," said little Charlie Tencharles. "Yes," said Miss Hippiness, "and accidents hurting people faster than seconds in a clock, and people fighting each other and cursing each other with words we don't even know anymore." "Like some Davidge," cried Mary, Mary, Mary. Miss Hippiness rolled her eyes in joy. "It was a son of a bitch, dear," she said. "It was a string of tiny real words that slished off the tongue like a string of bright little silver daggers." "Yes, teacher," the children chorused, squirming in wonder. "And there were the gangsters, those wonderful, wonderful eccentric persons like the Robin Hoods and Beowulfs I've told you about. And yes, there were the bombs that went bam and boom and wham and made beautiful colours in high gorgeous mushrooming clouds, like the pictures in the ancient book I smuggled in to show you the other day." "And people blown to bits," said Stan 30 Stanley in a fake grown-up voice. "To little itsy-bitsy bits," Miss Hippiness cried. "The 20th century, children. Ah, what happiness to have lived then! The whole world violent and dangerous and seething and exciting like a string of storybooks every inch of the way around the equator. But where you could be an individual, your own boss, they used to call it." She couldn't sit now. She raised her massive hips off the straight chair and began pacing up and down the room, her face like an ancient television screen, and the children's eyes followed her like a hungry puppy's after a mama dog. "It was the final splurge, children, of the individual man," she said. "Nowadays we have a world of people, all the same, all dull, all safe and healthy and secure. Then it was a world of persons, and in between every bit of violence there was a cosy bit of restful safety. In between every bit of anger there was a silent bit of cosy peace. For every tragic moment there was a moment of sunny happiness." "And were people really, really allowed to die by themselves?" asked Charlie Tencharles. She stopped and bent a loving glance on him. In the 20th century he would have been called teacher's pet. He was a dear and a doll and an angel. "Oh, many, many good people," she said, a catch in her voice, "died by themselves. Imagine, some were taken by old age. And, as we said last week, there were those wonderful sicknesses. A person could die of one of those. Nobody in the whole 20th century had a card in the Central Bureau which had on it the date of their death. Think of it, children." She was wound up now. Coming to the new part she had to tell them, the part about electronics, which had been an infant science at the start of the 20th century. Matter transmitters were not known, nor disintegrators. Robots were just on the horizon. Radio and television came to flower. Man was just beginning to step off the face of the world into deep space. And there were so few people on Earth that there were open fields all over every continent. Fine blowing trees everywhere, and real live wild flowers. Man started the 20th century in complete privacy, she said, her vast hips quivering as she paced. Then came the time. This was during the years of the gangsters, when electronics helped man put tiny ears in rooms behind pictures on the walls so private speech could be recorded. And telephones. Did I tell you what telephones were? Could be tapped, as they called it, so other people could listen in when you had secrets to tell a friend. And then, she told them, late in the 20th century came the best part of the story, the discovery that man could wiretap other men so secretly that nobody knew. Think of it, she cried. You could be telling your secrets to Papa, and then later Papa would be called in to a police station and his wiretap taken out, and everything you said was recorded on a tiny spool inside him. Ah, said the children, relishing the shudder of it all. It was like a prehistoric ghost story, possible but weird, because it had no connection to known life. But the human wiretaps didn't last long, said Miss Hippiness, making a serious comic face which brought a ripple of laughter to the 12 youngsters. By early in the 21st century, every part of the world had passed laws so nobody ever again could be wiretapped. She looked at the clock. In 2 minutes, the pills would wear off. Enough for today, children, she announced. But how about the gangsters? Mary asked in a petulant voice. Please, Miss Hippiness, you said... Enough for today, Miss Hippiness said sternly. It's time to go home. We'll tell more stories tomorrow. She said it just in time. The sun blinked out. A bell tinkled, and the school day was over. The children stood up and waited. All right, said Miss Hippiness with a smile. Single file, children. To the transmitter in your right order. The children walked, like children always have, with spurting giggles and sudden scuffles, toward the gleaming wire cage, festooned with pretty cutouts of colourful animals and buildings and trees. Mary was always the first this year. She stood in front of the transmitter opening, let the electronic beam play on her forehead identification disc, then stepped in. Swap. She was gone. Delivered to her home, delivered to her mama and papa. And she wouldn't remember a thing of the story hour, Miss Hippiness thought happily. But maybe, when she grew up, maybe when they all grew up, things would erupt here and there from their subconscious, and... They each stood their moment for the beam to catch their discs, stepped in, and were swooped off. At last only Charlie Tencharles was left, and he scurried around, like teachers' pets in memorial, helping Miss Hippiness do the last things a classroom needs to put it to rest for the night. Miss Hippiness gave his shoulders a last motherly squeeze and pushed him in front of the matter transmitter. Tomorrow? She said. His young grin was like wine in her blood. He stepped in and was swooped instantly. Miss Hippiness sighed and went back to sit on a straight chair. It wasn't comfortable, and it wasn't pretty, but it somehow fit whatever had been happening inside her the last year or two. She glanced at the faint shimmer inside the transmitter where Charlie had been swooped. He was such a darling, quiet, shy, adorable. If they had allowed her to have a son, instead of decreeing that she be a childless teacher, she said, but she couldn't finish the thought. It was when the children went that she felt the growing anger and unrest and sickness inside her. It was terrible when the children left. She wondered how long it had been now since she had seen the real surface of the earth. She swooped back and forth, morning and night, from her sleeping room to her classroom. They were 1,000 miles apart, actually, but an instant apart through the transmitter. And she had been swooping to that old library in the south of what had been France to browse in the forgotten ancient books there. But she never went outdoors. She never saw the sky any more. Why, it must be spring, she said aloud, and I've not seen a creek or a river in how long? If she had been allowed to have a son, and that son had been Charlie Tencharles, what fun it would have been to leave school every afternoon and be swooped to seashores, to brooks, to mountain peaks, to the moon, to the tiny parks that still remained occasionally in cities. She sat on her hard, straight chair, uncomfortable but unmoving, for a half-hour, deep in the reveries that so often beset her now. And then the beeper on the matter transmitter sounded. With a puzzled frown, she got up to press the admittance button. Little Charlie materialized and came out of the wire cage. "Charlie," she cried, "does your mamma know you come back?" He didn't answer. He went to stand in front of the straight chair, and she followed him, sitting down and putting her hands on his shoulders. "Charlie," she said in her fake, stern voice, "you should always ask your mamma before you—" Charlie's lips came open, but it wasn't Charlie's little voice which came out. "Susan 50, Susan," said a deep grown-up voice. "This is Holmes 1 Holmes. Remember? I was one of your pupils 40 years or more ago." Miss Hippiness remembered instantly. She remembered Holmes as a child, but she knew what he was now. He headed the bureau known only by an electronic symbol. Too secret to name, it was said in high circles. Miss Hippiness dropped her hands from little Charlie's shoulders and covered her face. Things twitched and twerked like little knives somewhere deep inside her. Fear? Horror? "You were my greatest, my very best teacher," said Holmes 1 Holmes on the recording coming through little Charlie's open lips. "And I have treasured your memory. So you know how hateful is my task this afternoon." Miss Hippiness peeked at Charlie's face through her fingers. His little blue eyes were blank, fastened to a spot high on the classroom wall behind her. There was no tiny bit of expression on his face. She heard Holmes 1 Holmes cough, and his voice went on, official this time, all pupilness erased. "Susan 50, Susan," he said. "The latest recording from inside Charlie Tencharles, which we have just heard, convicts you beyond reprieve. Where you found the human wiretap information we do not know, but we'll find it and destroy it. It is the order that your future disintegration date is hereby superseded. Instead of disintegration 2 years and 10 days from now, you will proceed to the nearest disintegrator within the hour." Miss Hippiness lowered her face, and her old eyes began sparking. Nobody ever knew the disintegration dates which the computers put on the card at birth. Nobody ever knew when they had to march into one of those horrid machines and cease living. But to learn that her own had been set a mere 2 years away, and she in the prime of life. "Son of a bitch," she said, using the first 20th century epithet that came to mind. "You are convicted," Holmes 1 Holmes was saying, "of spreading sedition and danger to our entire world in an unthinkable way, tampering with the minds of our children." "As if you don't tamper with children," she shouted. "And it is the order that there be no appeal from this verdict." Miss Hippiness sat straighter. In the 20th century, no matter what, for gangster, for statesman, for teacher, there would have been an appeal, and even another appeal, and perhaps another appeal. Life was still rich and treasured in the 20th century. So she held the 20th century before her angry eyes, letting it blot out the dirty old disintegrator in its corner. How had they learned what she was doing to the sweet children? Holmes 1 Holmes' voice changed texture. "Miss Hippiness, they call you now," he said, almost fondly. "We had another name for you years ago." Almost a chuckle. "It was even better than Miss Hippiness. Don't hate little Charlie, Miss Hippiness. He is an android, naturally. We had him made last year after the Freudists began picking up troublesome things in the dreams of the children you had in class. Charlie has been a wiretap, Miss Hippiness." The old teacher's eyes clamped on Charlie Tenchall's, but then they softened. She shook her head. It made no difference. If they had allowed her to have a son— "We caught an affection beyond affection," one Holmes was saying, "in your voice when you talked to our android. So since he has finished his service to us, I decided to send him back to you, Miss Hippiness. He will march into the disintegrator with you." A faint click told her the recording inside Charlie had played itself out. Charlie moved almost immediately. His eyes came down from the high wall to her face. He grinned, and she grinned back. "Charlie Tencharles," she said gruffly, "can't you stay away from Miss Hippiness? What a boy you are! You should be out playing, maybe in a park, maybe in a boat." "Or on a horse like in the 20th century?" he asked. She almost laughed. "Yes," she cried, "maybe like on a horse, with a gun on your hip. And a lasso to throw at things." Miss Hippiness got up from the straight chair. It was so sweet, why wait? She took little Charlie's hand, and they walked toward the disintegrator. There was a dreadful moment of hesitation in front of it. Miss Hippiness had heard of that last dreadful moment, and she let it rack her. Maybe this was a last relic of the 20th century, a last real, for sure, relic. Charlie's hand moved in hers, and she stooped quickly, enfolding him in her arms. "You know what?" she cried. "There was something else in the 20th century, Charlie. It was kissing." "Kissing?" he said. "Yes, and I'm going to kiss you, Charlie Tencharles, just like back then." He grinned as her lips came at him. "Oh, Miss Hippiness," he said. There is an odd difference in the minute sounds made by matter transmitters and disintegrators. The transmitter goes swoop, no matter who steps in, but the disintegrator goes shup, no matter who. Miss Hippiness stood up and took a deep breath, holding Charlie tight in her arms, almost like a baby. She didn't have to look. Having sent so many naughty children into the disintegrator years ago, she knew the way. She took the last 3 steps. Shup. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Bright Islands by Frank Riley. Originally published in Worlds of If Science Fiction, June 1955. Narrated by Tom Trussel. When the 2 Geno-doctors were gone, Miriam took the red capsule from under the base of the bed lamp and slipped it between her dry lips. Reason told her to swallow the capsule quickly, but instead she held it under her tongue, clinging, against her will, to the last few moments of life. She knew she was being weak, that she was still seeking hope where there was no hope, and she prayed to the ancient god of the ghetto that the gelatin coating would dissolve quickly. Pain interrupted the prayer, speeding like slow fire from deep within her young body, where the unwanted child of genetic center stirred so restlessly, so impatient to be born. The white walls of her center room blurred in and out of focus. Shadows merged together in brief, uncertain patterns. Lights flickered where there were no lights, and the darkness was so intense it had a glare of its own. At the worst of the pain cycle, Miriam bit down on her underlip until the flesh showed as white as her teeth. She fought off temptation to crunch the capsule and put an end to all pain, all fear. No, she would not go that way. She would go in a moment of blinding clarity, knowing why, savouring the last bitter-sweet second of her triumph. With a subconscious gesture of femininity, Miriam brushed the dark, damp hair from her forehead and wiped the perspiration from her lips. "Pretty little thing," one of the Geno service agents had called her when she was arrested last fall in the Warsaw suburb where she had taught nursery school since escaping from the ghetto. "Doesn't look a bit like one of her kind," another agent had said, putting his hand under her chin and turning her face to the glare of his flashlight. "No wonder she fooled the psycho and chemico squads. Lucky for us." "What's the matter, little one?" the first agent had spoken again. "Didn't you know we were coming? I thought all of you people were supposed to be telepaths. Well, doesn't it work when you're asleep?" He flipped the covers off her trembling body and whistled. "Hands off," the Geno sergeant had warned sharply. "She's for center." Now the capsule under her tongue was moist and soft. Time fled on swift, fluttering wings. Soon the horror would be done. But the stubborn spark still glowed, and Miriam allowed her mind to drift down the long, shining corridor to the room where the younger of the two Geno doctors was changing into a white coat. The older man, who wore the gold trefoil of Geno Sar on his collar, tilted back in his chair. "She should be just about due," he said cheerfully. "Yes, sir," replied the young doctor, sounding the proper note of deference for a man who communed daily with the political elite. "What do you think of her?" "Well, sir, frankly, I was surprised." The young doctor twisted muscular arms to button the back of his jacket. He had but recently come from the genetic sanitarium on the Black Sea, and his face was tanned deep brown. "From reading the weekly reports of your staff, I didn't know she was that young." Miriam trembled with a hope she dared not recognize, but it was crushed out of her by the Geno Sar's booming voice. "Not only one of the youngest, but one of the very best specimens we've had to work with at Center. You read her psi rating?" "Yes, sir. 72.4, wasn't it?" 72.6! Absolutely phenomenal! Closest thing to a pure telepath our agents have ever turned up for us. This could be a big night for Center, my boy. A big night." The young doctor shook his head to clear away the lingering image of a tragic, lovely face against a tear-stained pillow. Miriam was startled to find this image in his mind, and her pulse leapt again. In a carefully professional tone, the young doctor asked, "What was her rating after insemination? Did the emotional shock—" "Not at all. Oh, naturally she was uncooperative in the tests, but pentothal and our cross-references gave us a true picture." "And the spermatozoa?" "Best we could get. Refrigerated about 30 years ago from a specimen that tested 47.8. The Geno Sar paused, and because a comment was obviously in order, the young doctor said, "This certainly could be a big night for Center." The Geno Sar snapped his cigarette lighter with an expansive flourish. "All the sciences have been taking a crack at psi, ever since the last Politburo directive gave it #1 priority. You should have heard the talk at Tsar Bureau meeting this afternoon. The math Tsar actually laughed at genetics, told us to stick to our white mice." The young doctor made a polite cluck of disapproval. "Those stupid mathematicians should learn something of heredity from their own ancients," the Geno Sar continued, growing heated. "Think of Leibniz, gifted at 14. Galois, a genius before he was 21. The Geno Sar recovered his temper and winked. "Of course, I didn't say that at the meeting. The bureau chief is very partial to math. But I did remind them, most pointedly, of the known data on inherited sensory differences between individuals, and you should have seen the squirming, especially when I got into the taste studies and the phenylthiocarbamide tests. Then, when I told of genetics research on sense of time, sense of direction, sensitivity to pain, sound, and smells, well, the chief was hanging on my every word.
The Psycho-Tsar became desperate to the point of rashness, and he jibed at me about our ancient master, Profim Lysenko. The Geno-Tsar's head inclined slightly as he pronounced the name. But the chief himself gave the correct answer. He quoted from a bureau directive which stated clearly that sensory characteristics, like any others, could well have been acquired in the first place, and then passed on through heredity. Oh, I tell you, it was a heart-warming afternoon. The younger man had been paying him only half attention. It's strange we should find some cases of psi among her people, he mused. When I was at the university, I always meant to study something about the... He hesitated, and searched for the approved term. The specimen races, but I never had time. For an instant, the Geno-Tsar's steel-blue eyes narrowed, and Miriam was shocked to find him appraising the young man for possible heresy. She had always regarded the scientific mind as something remote, cold, but never as something that could commit a heresy. However, the Geno-Tsar decided to table the subject. "Of course you didn't," he boomed. "You couldn't have made such a splendid record without total specialization. Each to his own, that's how science has prospered under the benevolence of our party." He glanced up at the clock. "Well, aren't we just about ready for this delivery?" Miriam drew back her mind. What a fool she was to go on seeking. The child resumed its inexorable turning within her swollen body, and she knew she could never give to the world a life conceived so terribly, so coldly, without love or passion or tenderness. Even in these final moments, with the gelatin melting under her tongue, Miriam shuddered with the remembered anguish of struggling up from the depths of anesthesia to find herself bearing the seed of a child from a faceless man who had died long ago. Often, during the carefully guarded months of pregnancy, she had wondered about that man, who he had been, how his talent had compared with hers. Miriam knew little about genetics or any other science. The scientific mind had always frightened her, and she had feared to explore it. But she knew there was no truth to the folklore that psi was a characteristic of her people. She knew of only a few cases outside her own family, although within her family it seemed to have been a characteristic that had recurred frequently for many generations. Her father had cautioned her about selecting a husband, and pleaded with her not to flee the ghetto. For the past 3 days, since the nurse had momentarily left the cabinet at the end of the corridor unlocked and unguarded, Miriam had known that she need not be concerned about the success or failure of this terrible experiment. From the nurse's mind she had plucked the essential facts about the potency of the red capsule. This knowledge, for all its loneliness, had been something to cherish, to press to her full breasts, as she would never hold that child of horror. Tears filled her eyes, squeezed in droplets between the closed lids. Tears because she was so alone. Tears of unbearable sadness and pity for her people, for her youth and her young body, for the warmth that would be eternally cold, for the unnatural child that squirmed and turned and would never cry. In a last forlorn gesture, in a final seeking before the darkness closed, Miriam let her mind stray out of the white room, out of the marble magnificence of centre. She let her thoughts escape on the soft breeze of the early summer evening. How beautiful it was, even here in the city, amid the science buildings that formed bright islands of light around the minarets and vaulted domes of Government Square. Even these awesome buildings were lovely in the purple dusk. The windows were like scattered emeralds of light. How could there be so much beauty without compassion, so much knowledge without understanding, so much human genius without humanity? And what a battering of thoughts in the mild air around the centres of science! What a discordance! What a tumult of theories, each of them nurtured within its own walls by the zealous Tsars! There were the departments of chemistry and physics. There was the glass-walled tower of astronomy. There was the Institute of Psychology with all its many bureaus, and the new electronics building, alabaster even in the dusk. They were all there, extending in stately splendour along the main avenues and along the park where the gossamer mist was rising. How intolerant were the thoughts they radiated! How sure! Electronics said, "Quite obviously, the answer to psi is in the electrical currents of the brain. Our newest electroencephalograph has demonstrated." Chemistry said, "Solution to psi inevitably will be found in the chemical balance of the cells." Parapsychology said, "We must continue to ignore those who insist upon attributing physical properties to a non-physical characteristic." And underneath this learned babble, Miriam heard the moth-like whispering of her own people, starving in the ghetto, or hidden throughout the city, disguised, furtive, tense. Her mind came close to Government Square, and she cringed as she had cringed all her young life. The somatics were unbearable: hatred and fear, blind prejudice, jealousy, cunning, ceaseless intrigue and plotting, setting Tsar against Tsar, using the genius of each science, dividing and ruling. No, there was nothing left. No hope, no promise. This was the end of time. This was the night of the world. Withdrawing again, retreating into itself, Miriam's mind brushed the fragment of a thought. It was a half-formed thought, more a groping, more a question than an idea. It was delicate, fragile, a wraith and a wisp, but it came to her as clear as a note from a silver bell. Startled, she hesitated in a withdrawal, and perceived the young geno-doctor in the corridor near her room. He had paused by the casement window, and was staring out at the twinkling islands of light around Government Square. And as his gaze wandered moodily from tech to psycho to chemico, to all the incandescent isolated centres of genius, the idle speculation had formed. Wouldn't it be an unusual view if all those bright islands were connected by strings of light? Once formed, the speculation had fanned the ember of a thought. Wonder if psi will build those strings of light? Then the young doctor turned almost guiltily from the window to meet the Genosar coming down the corridor, and he said with crisp efficiency, "I'll check out 12A for delivery." "Good boy, I'll go up and check the staff." The Genosar rubbed his hands together and walked off, repeating nervously, "2 psi characteristics must be the answer. 2 psi." "Maybe they are," the young doctor murmured softly. "Maybe they are." Delivery, Miriam thought. The life within her throbbed and prodded. There was an ebbing of pain for a moment, and in that moment she saw with the blinding clarity she had sought that this child of hers might bring new hope to the world. That psi ability might be the answer to many things for the race of mankind. What did it matter that it was conceived without love and emotion? What did it matter that she was being used as an experiment? If this child within her could fulfill the promise. Miriam spat the soft capsule between her quivering lips. She watched it roll and bounce across the polished tile floor toward the door. Pain returned, and its fire was warm. There were no shadows on the wall. Pain returned, and it had purpose and promise. Wonderingly, she beheld the concept that science, too, lived with fear, each science in its own ghetto. And if the young doctor was right, if psi... As the doctor stepped into the room, he bent over and picked up the red capsule. His thumb and forefinger felt the warmth, the moisture, and he looked long and thoughtfully into Miriam's dark, glowing eyes. His fingers shook as he wrapped the capsule in a piece of tissue and dropped it into the pocket of his white jacket. He picked up the chart from the foot of the bed. "Miriam?" His voice was not under complete control, and he began again with an effort at lightness. "Miriam, that's a strange name. What does it mean?" "It is an ancient spelling," she whispered, her eyes deep and dark, filled with pain and wonder. "You may find it easier to call me Mary."
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
Inhibition by James Causey. Originally published in Worlds of If Science Fiction, February 1955. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Planetfall. Here the forest was green and cool. A soft damp wind promised rain. The colonists moved down the ramp, staring at the crew members piling crates of supplies in the meadow beyond. Frowns, then whispers. Saxon glanced up. His nostrils flared. "Hurry," he told the crewman, and came forward, beaming. He was tired. It showed in his feverish, too-bright smile as he said, "Afraid engineering's a little behind schedule. They'll be here tomorrow morning to erect your city. Tonight you'll have to rough it." Reactions varied. The women murmured and moved closer to their men. Some smiled. One man thoughtfully eyed the mounting pyramid of supplies. "You're getting a choice world, Jarl," Saxon said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Survey spent 30 years here, balancing the ecology, wiping out the bugs and carnivores. Eden." Saxon tasted the word like wine. Jarl Madsen's face was stone. "Aren't they all named Eden?" From the forest came a chittering bark, like anthropomorphic laughter. Saxon shivered, remembering the thing that chittered, the 3-inch fangs and the talons. "Hardly," he lied. "That, incidentally, was a gnarl, herbivore, very harmless." Madsen walked past him, towards the supplies. Saxon moved among the colonists, shaking hands, congratulating, speaking of green fields and good crops and a virgin planet where every man could carve an empire. These last moments were the worst, when you said goodbye, knowing that 30% of them would be dead within the week. He saw Madsen opening a supply case. Damn him, just 3 more minutes. The last crew member dumped his load and hurried into the airlock. Saxon started casually after him. Too late. Madsen stood there, his grin taut, nailed on. "Primitive prefab shelters," he said thickly. "Axes and seeds. The city was a lie. We're on our own, is that it? Why?" Saxon's palm flashed, and Madsen fell, writhing. There were shouts, hands clawing at him as he tore free, sprinting for the ship. "Always running," he thought bitterly. "I'm getting old." He walked through the silent corridors of the ship, a lonely figure in the black uniform of the Inhibition Corps, and once he stared through the porthole at Eden 21, a mottled sphere receding into the star-frosted night. His mouth twisted. Conceive a colony in fear. Breed it in terror. Watch it adapt, grow. If it grows too fast, hurt it. Hurt it with disease, famine, dictatorship. If it keeps growing, destroy it. The captain came down the corridor and stood at respectful attention before the black uniform. "Stereo call, Commander. Prime base." Saxon slowly went to his cabin. The stereo panel was flashing steady crimson to designate top priority, and he restrained a savage impulse to shut the thing off. He slumped in the control chair, and the tri-dye image of a man at a desk slowly coalesced. It was a granite-featured old man with eyes like blue ice, and Saxon's head snapped sharply erect. It was Primus Gaunt, Corps Director. At 90 parsecs, Gaunt's features were slightly hazed, but his voice was clear, sharp as a sword. "Report, Commander." "My extrapolation went through an hour ago. Also my resignation." Nothing moved in Gaunt's face or his eyes. Saxon said stiffly, "Planetfall uneventful, area inimical, initial shock conception, probable god betrayal mythology by 4th generation. Those things in the forest should get 30% of them the first week. Weaponless, they'll run. The 2-to-1 female ratio should make for an agricultural matriarchy by the 6th generation. Recommend intermittent check at that time." He took a slow, angry breath. "Why didn't we give them weapons?" Gaunt's smile was acid. "Because we haven't yet tried an agricultural matriarchy, Commander. Because the lower the initial survival factor, the slower the culture development. Getting squeamish?" Saxon said doggedly, "They didn't have a chance." "Neither did 20 million people on Earth in the last atomic war." The director's voice was soft. "All colonists volunteer. Some have a vision. Others have a latent power drive that stasis can't satisfy. They're misfits regardless, potential threats to stasis. Remember your last leave, Commander. I believe you met my son." Saxon nodded curtly. He remembered the director's son as a quiet, soft-spoken youth with a yearning for far places in his eyes. "I had hoped he would qualify for the Corps." Gaunt looked suddenly old, tired. "Instead, he's volunteering for colonial service." "Did you ever lose a son, Commander?" They stared at each other across the humming emptiness, and Saxon finally whispered, "I'm sorry." "Stasis is all we can afford," the director said numbly. "Man can't have utopia yet, because he's still man. Perhaps he'll never have it, but by God he'll try." "Resignation withdrawn?" Saxon nodded. He could not speak. "I'm glad. The ship's captain had orders to burn you down had you refused." Gaunt's face was wooden. "Inhibition agents never quit. They just die in harness. You'll take the lifeboat to Eden 11 for 6th generation check. Good hunting, Commander." The image faded. Saxon sat for a long time, staring into the darkness. Eden 11 was 3 parsecs distant, near Algol. For the next 10 hours, Saxon paced the marvelously equipped lifeboat and absorbed data from the robot recorder. He stared at the hard crystal ache of the stars and thought of the director's son. He thought about the shining cities of Earth and about stasis. Stasis meant control. It meant control of 1 billion people, a rigid planetary economy. It meant the assassination branch of the Corps. Assassination, carefully contrived to appear accidental, took care of those few malcontents who were either too smart or too stupid to sign up for colonization. It meant a gradual weeding out of the unsane, the power-mad. It meant learning the true meaning of sanity and peace and racial brotherhood. And it meant the stagnation of science, a thick film of dust gathering on the textbooks of the military tactician, and warships rotting at anchor. It meant the white spire of the Stasis Administration Center at New Washington, and the words graven over the golden portals, Know thyself, man, or die. Was the dream worth it? Or was man doomed to die like a brawling ape playing with lightning? Saxon could not answer. Meanwhile, the colonies had to be inhibited. One interplanetary war could smash the fragile structure so painstakingly built over the last few hundred years. This was the turning point, the final crossroads of man's destiny. Saxon smiled bleakly. Ultimately, there would be a colony they could neither inhibit or destroy. The adaptive ultimate. That colony would be man no longer, but Homo superior. But by then, it wouldn't matter. The lifeboat came in on the night side of Eden 11 and hung above the blue mountains like a basking shark. Saxon checked his coordinates. This had been the original landing site, almost 200 years ago. He switched the infraview on maximum and began to cruise in widening spirals. These sixth-generation hops were usually routine. If nomadic, a few political shifts could help warp the culture into a set pattern. A simple matter to play the visiting deity, pick one warped psychotic, and invest him with power. A dictatorship was by far the best way of inhibiting a young culture. Agricultural city-states were almost as easy. Designate a particular crop as sacred, kill the rotation program, impoverish the land, introduce serfdom. By dawn, Saxon found what he was looking for, a row of cleared fields and a farmhouse. He reconnoitred 100 miles farther and frowned. There was no clump of dwellings, no sign of a village trading community. He brought the ship down in a forest 3 miles away from the farmhouse and camouflaged it to look like a great mossy boulder. He spent the entire morning testing the atmosphere and the soil with a savage patience. In the early years of the Corps, virus mutations had taken a fearful toll of intermittent spotters. Finally, he discarded his uniform and selected a pair of homespuns from the ship's wardrobe locker. Under the homespuns reposed his utility kit, a miniature arsenal. Late that afternoon he emerged from the forest and stood at the edge of the cleared fields, a weather-beaten itinerant, obviously willing to chop wood for a meal. Abruptly his jaw muscle twitched. The scene was pastoral, perfect. The man ploughing the South 40, the little girl playing in the shadow of the sleepy farmhouse. But no beast pulled that plough. A giant of a man with power and intelligence stamped on his bronze features pushed the plough by hand in a die-straight furrow. The little girl was blonde and elfin. She wore sandals. Her tunic was brief and plain. She was playing Follow the Leader with a robot. The robot was tall. The sun struck sparks from its steel carapace as it lumbered after the girl. Saxon stood frozen as she came flying towards him in a burst of tossing blonde hair and laughter as she saw him and came to a dead halt. "Hello," Saxon said. He tried to smile. "Hello." Her inflection was slurred, after 6 generations naturally. Her blue eyes sparkled. "Footsore, stranger." The words had the cadence of a ritual greeting. Saxon stared at the robot and said carefully, "Yes." "He's only a primer model," she said, following his gaze. "Next year when I'm 12, Father promised to install secondary circuits. My name's Vina. What's yours?" Saxon introduced himself as the giant at the plough came forward. His white smile was a benediction, his voice a lambent organ. "Welcome, Rover. Haven't seen one of you in months. I'm Lang, agricultural hobbyist. You'll stay?" His tone was almost pleading. Saxon nodded inarticulately, followed them towards the farmhouse. His hands were shaking. The interior of the house was dimensionless. For a moment Saxon thought he was still outside. A silver brook tinkled through the mossy carpet that was the floor. The south wall was a golden vista of ripe wheat rippling in the warm breeze that ruffled his hair. Birds twittered in the sun-flecked foliage overhead. "Nice house," Saxon said numbly. Lang's smile was different. "A bit pretentious, I'm afraid. Grandfather built it right after the landing. We've been too lazy to do much remodeling. A remarkable man, Grandfather." That explained it, Saxon thought in relief. One titan in an infant colony, warping it into a utopian mould, passing on the heritage of his genius. How long, he wondered coldly, before they built starships and returned to demolish the earth which had exiled them? "It must be wonderful to be a rover," Vina said wistfully. "Lang, can I go with him when he leaves?" "You haven't completed basic ecology. Mentor's waiting for your afternoon session." Vina pouted and went outside to her robot. Lang grinned. "The precocious brat's beginning to ask him questions he can't answer. Soon I'll have to install a few more circuits." Saxon shivered. Regardless of scientific attainment, any culture is vulnerable to inhibition. So said his agent's handbook. Later he met Vina's mother, Merle, a handsome woman with calm grey eyes who served them dinner by firelight. It was a good dinner. These colonists seemed like good people. A shame they qualified for inhibition. Gently, Saxon began to probe. In only 6 generations, the colonists had scattered throughout the entire hemisphere. Although the matrix of their culture seemed to be the individual family unit, they lived according to whim. Some lived in small communal groups. Some lived alone. Some, by choice, were wanderers, rovers. They had science. Their philosophy seemed nebulous, based on a benevolent ecology, brotherhood with all living things. Saxon frowned. 6 generations ago, the ecology on this world hardly had been benevolent for man. This area of the continent had been a steaming marsh swarming with hungry saurians. Now it was all meadow and forest. Saxon said thoughtfully, "Have you ever felt the need for organization? For a leader?" He leaned back and waited for the seed to sprout. 2 years ago, on Eden 8, near Rigel, he had said the same thing to a 6th-generation shaman, and it took scarcely a month for the shaman to start an intra-tribal war. But now the seed fell on sterile ground. Lang said, "I don't understand. Any problem which cannot be solved at family level is referred to the annual council." "A leader," Saxon was patient. "One strong man to represent everybody. To settle all problems as he sees fit." "Remember, Father," Vina prodded, "those arboreal cannibals Grandfather used to mention. They had a nomadic tribal culture based on brute strength." Lang nodded somberly. "Good analogy. The most favorable extrapolation indicated a racial life expectancy of only 10,000 years. Their emotional stability index was nil. They would eventually have destroyed themselves. The first generation decided it would be more merciful to exterminate them. An unwise decision, I think." He launched into a spirited ethnological discussion with Vina, and Saxon sat numbly. They had no emotional insecurity to feed, no power hunger, no herd instinct to pervert, nothing to utilize as destruction potential. No cultural weakness. The room they gave him was small and comfortable. For a time he lay on the sleeping hammock, considering the situation. He was beginning to like them. That in itself was dangerous. The house was very still. He got quietly out of the hammock and crept towards the door. He had to get back to the lifeboat to feed facts into the monitor. One thing disturbed him. According to his agent's handbook, family group anarchies didn't need inhibition. He was halfway across the ploughed field when Mentor's iron voice said, "Good evening." Moonfire glimmered on metal. The robot stood impassively before him. Saxon said slowly, "I was just going for a walk." "You are our guest. I shall walk with you." "I prefer to walk alone." "Guests prefer company. The House of Lang must observe the basic amenities." Was there a hint of sardonicism in Mentor's voice? They walked along the furrows, man and robot. Saxon felt beneath his shirt for the utility kit. He kept his voice level. "Am I a prisoner?" "You are a guest." "Did Rena tell you I might try to escape?" A pause while relays clicked silently. "That is classified information." Saxon's fingers were steady as they touched his tiny blaster. "Benevolent anarchy, indeed," he said carefully. "Do the colonists resent their exile?" Another pause. Mentor's voice was a flat drone. "The concept is meaningless, the question invalid." Like hell it is, thought Saxon, and fired. A cold blue wash of energy illuminated the robot. For a moment Saxon was blinded. When vision returned, he saw Mentor standing immobile, unscathed. "Please go back to bed," the robot said. Saxon went back to bed. Next morning, Vina brought him breakfast. She seemed sad, withdrawn. "Lang and Merle went to visit Aunt Tarsi. She lives near the equator. They won't be back till evening." "How?" Saxon had trouble breathing. "How did they go?" "By transmitter, of course." She indicated a large shimmering platform in one corner. "Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot rovers hate the mention of any type of gadgetry." Her eyes grew impossibly earnest. "But we try to achieve some kind of balance, really. Once, when I suggested that Father let Mentor help him plough the fields, he got furious." Saxon restrained wild laughter. First the robot, invulnerable to atomic energy. Now a matter transmitter. Yet they ploughed their own fields. "Vina," he said. She looked up at him. "Why did you tell Mentor to keep me here?" She bowed her bright head. Her blue eyes were brimming. "Why, Vina?" "Because I like you," she sniffled. "I wanted you to stay." Abruptly she fled from the room. He stood bleakly looking after her. After a time he went outside and struck across the field towards the forest. This time the robot did not stop him. Do not allow the emotional charm of any culture, nor any individual of that culture, to sway your inhibition appraisal. In the narrow confines of the lifeboat he repeated the quotation grimly. Good inhibition agents are inflexible. He was a good agent. For almost an hour he fed data into the monitor tapes. Then he touched a stud and closed his eyes, waiting for judgment. "Agricultural family group societies are normally stagnant," the monitor droned. "Such cultures, regardless of technological level, do not warrant inhibition of any type. Reference, 12th generation check on Eden 5. The room spun. Saxon whispered, "But they have cybernetics, matter transmitters." "Regardless of technological level," the monitor was adamant. This was madness. Saxon wiped his forehead and said, "Assuming geographical isolation no barrier to united group action in the event of emergency." United action is incompatible with family group. Schumann advise. Relays chattered. Abruptly, the entire panel flashed crimson. The monitor spoke one word. Annihilation. Saxon referred to his Inhibition handbook. He had never annihilated a culture before. 1 hour later, he went into the forest. Birds sang overhead. The sun dappled him in light and shadow. He stalked a small furry quadruped that squealed at him from a log and brought it down with his sonic pistol. Back in the lifeboat, he watched the animal regain consciousness in an airtight tank, and very slowly he pulled a lever. A green vapor rolled into the tank. The quadruped screamed. The green vapor fed. It was the penultimate in sporedom, yet it was more than a spore. It had virus characteristics, and its propagation rate was almost mathematically impossible. There was no known defense, and once used, the entire planet was forever untouchable. To Saxon's knowledge, it had been utilized only once, on Eden 1. At dusk, he took the lifeboat up 50 miles. He released the spores in a widening spiral and finally jettisoned the tank. He went into an orbit at 10,000 miles and waited. It would take approximately a week. It was a long week. Saxon slept little. He paced the cabin. He looked at the stars and thought about a blue-eyed waif with tears in her voice begging him to stay. After a week, the lifeboat came down at the edge of a grassy plain. Saxon took a sample of the contaminated atmosphere to determine propagation rate. The atmosphere was pure. Some freak of expansion. One uncontaminated spot in a hemisphere of death. He selected another location, then another. That evening, he chose the coordinates of his original landing site and tested the air again. Finally, he went outside the airlock. He breathed deeply, and the air was fresh and sweet. It smelled of forest and cool streams and evening dew. In the blue dusk, birds twittered. A small marsupial, very much like a squirrel, scampered to the safety of a tree and scolded him. Saxon began walking. At the edge of the forest, he saw the familiar ploughed field. The farmhouse was a friendly beacon in the twilight. "Hello," Vina said. She stood at the edge of the forest. She was smiling. "Welcome home, Rover." For the next few days, Saxon was the perfect guest. He argued philosophical abstractions with the family by firelight. By day, he hiked in the woods with Vina and listened to Mentor give her lessons. He asked questions. "Vina, do you know what a microorganism is?" "Benevolent or malignant?" "Malignant. A plague." She pursed her lips. "Organic or cultural?" "Organic, of course." "Bacteria?" Vina shrugged. "Quite a few of the first generation died immediately after the landing, until they adapted, until they analyzed the basic metabolism of the planet's dominant life forms and constructed a neutralizer." "A neutralizer?" "A protective shell of ionized particles," she said patiently, "keyed to the individual body chemistry." "Classified information," Mentor droned. Saxon licked his lips. "You mentioned cultural microorganisms?" "Much more deadly. I call them that, but Lang says I'm being semantically unsound. War, for example. Racial inferiority. To date, we haven't found a cure." She broke off, and her eyes were shining wet. "But you don't have wars," Saxon said. "No." "Then?" "We have a ghetto," the girl said slowly. "I can't tell you about it. Perhaps soon." Abruptly she changed the subject. Slowly, Saxon's defences began to crumble. To all intents, he was now a member of Lang's household, Vena's adopted big brother. Big brother or pet? It did not really matter. On the 4th day, he went back to the lifeboat. He remembered his graduation day, the crash of the corps anthem, and the pledge, "I do faithfully swear to uphold the ideals of man, to use this vested power for the absolute good of Earth. I will not shrink from any cup of duty, regardless of how bitter. I will guard stasis with my life, and the lives of innocent people if need be, people whose only crime may be that they are potential threats to stasis." He tinkered with the ship's reactor for an hour. Then he ran. Behind him, the lifeboat dissolved in a white blossom of flame. Farewell, the cold stars and the ache and the loneliness. Farewell, the destruction of newborn colonies to secure the rotting stagnancy of Earth. He would have a great many bad nights, but he was used to bad nights. He thought of Vena, and his stride quickened. She would be a beautiful woman. They were waiting for him back at the farmhouse, Lang, Vena, and Merle. They were staring at the dark pyre of smoke in the forest. Saxon took a deep breath and squared his shoulders. "I've got a confession to make." They weren't listening. Lang said quietly, "You were right, Vena. He may qualify." "Come." Merle took her husband's arm. "Let's call the council." They went inside. Saxon looked at Vena. He moistened his lips. "You knew," he said. She nodded. There was a queer adult maturity about her as she said, "Wait, they're calling an emergency council meeting to decide if you're fit." "Fit," Saxon said. Coldly, it seeped in. "To survive? To be a playmate? A slave?" "It's been a game," he said, grasping her shoulders. "You've known all along." "They're taking the transmitter to the landing site now," she said. "Would you like to watch?" Watch judgment of the outcasts on one of those who had marooned them? Why not? Lang and Merle were no longer in the house. Vena touched a silver stud in one corner, and one side of the room dissolved from a vista of golden wheat to a grassy amphitheatre. There were people assembled in the clearing. Lang and Merle stood on a mossy dais, making a speech. He saw the ship. It was a giant silver ovoid, fretted with strange veins, pockmarked by the red cancer of rust. Towering forest patriarchs guarded that ship like a woodland shrine. A ship that had never been born on Earth. An alien ship. Understanding came, and a quiet horror. He lurched away from the screen, away from Vena. He was outside now, and running. He was a good Inhibition agent. He had been conditioned to the shock of alien concepts for half his lifetime, but the ground reeled beneath him as he ran, and he could feel the hot trickle of blood where he had bitten through his lip to keep from screaming. Aliens. From outside. Homo superior, treating his ape brother with an hospitable contempt, playing their inscrutable game. The lifeboat came down almost in front of him. It came down with a whining snarl and settled into the ploughed field. The airlock opened. Primus Gaunt stepped out. His blue eyes were very cold, and he was smiling. "Report, Commander." Years of conditioned reflex brought him erect, made him whisper. "Mission unsuccessful." He swayed, almost fell. Gaunt held him. "Easy, lad. We got the blow-up a few minutes ago. It took us a while to home in on the distress transmitter in our utility kit. He chuckled at Saxon's blank stare. Whenever an agent's ship is destroyed, his utility belt automatically functions as a distress signal. Saxon shook his head painfully. "You've been waiting?" "We started 10 days ago, when your monitor gave out with the annihilation alarm." He eyed Saxon keenly. "Just how bad is it?" Saxon told him. Gaunt's face turned a dirty white. "Aliens," he said thickly. "They probably murdered the original colony. You've come through nicely, lad. It may mean promotion." He turned into the ship. "Come on." "Wait!" Saxon's voice was a dry whisper. "You're not going to—" "Demolition," Gaunt said. "I've got a task force up there that can crack a planet. Let's go, Commander." "I will not shrink from any cup of duty." "Please," Saxon said huskily. "I don't believe they're inimical to man. They're altruists." "So?" "They're benevolent," Saxon pleaded. "Both races can live together." "Don't be a fool," Gaunt grunted, and turned into the airlock. Saxon leapt. One palm came down hard at the base of the director's skull, and Gaunt twisted. He palmed the younger man with 2 deft blows, throat and plexus. Saxon slumped, retching. Gaunt stood above him, his smile strained. "Amateur," he panted. "I was instructing hand tactics before you were born." He took out his blaster. "They've infected you," he said compassionately. "I'm sorry, lad. You'll get a posthumous decoration." The blaster came up, steadied. Then Gaunt stood very still, a white-haired statue. Mentor came around the ship and helped Saxon to his feet. "Destroying guests is forbidden," the robot clicked. "The concept is irrational." Later, in the shadows of the farmhouse that was not a farmhouse, Saxon watched the scout disappear into the sky. He turned towards Vina. "You're letting him go?" "Mentor treated him," she said dreamily. "He'll report that you destroyed the colony, died in the process, and that this planet is unfit for further colonization. Incidentally, the council voted in the affirmative. Otherwise, you'd be with Gaunt." Aliens, playing a game with her ape brother, recognizing him at first glance, speaking his language, making him feel wanted, at home. Why? He was afraid to ask the question. "We're on a vacation," Vina said. "We've only been here for 1 generation. We were due to return almost 30 years ago, but we found your colony." "Did you?" "Isolation," she murmured. "The ghetto. They're sick," she said. "Infected with the culture plague. We couldn't leave them, and we couldn't help them." Her gaze was very steady. "Until you came." It came to him. Man, clutching at the knees of gods, envying, striving futilely, finally hating. Only man can help man. "It's not fair," Saxon breathed. He took Vina by the shoulders, made her look at him. "I'm happy here. You and Lang, Merle. I'm just beginning to learn. I'd hope that in a few years—" "We are not human," Vina said gently, "and our lifespan is 400 of your years." For the first time, he noticed the faint malformation of her ears, the subtle differences in facial bone structure. He glanced past her, saw Lang and Merle waiting in the doorway. "It will mean months of study," she said. "You have so much to unlearn, to understand. They may reject you, sacrifice you. That will not matter. What does matter is your impact on their culture, what it will mean 1,000 generations hence." Diseased apes, with a touch of godhood, suffering from an infection that might be forever incurable. Why should he be the sacrifice? Who was he to help them? Looking at Vina, he knew the answer. The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. The Happy Clown by Alice Eleanor Jones. Originally published in If Worlds of Science Fiction, December 1955. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Stephen Russell was born a misfit, a nonconformist, and for the first 5 years of his life he made himself and his parents extremely unhappy. The 21st century was perfect, and this inexplicable child did not like perfection. The first trouble arose over his food. His mother did not nurse him, since the doctors had proved that baby lac and the soft rainbow-coloured plastic containers in which it was warmed and offered were both a vast improvement on nature. Stephen drank the baby lac, but though it was hard to credit in so young a child, sometimes his face wore an expression of pure distaste. A little later he rejected the baby oatsies and fruitsies and meatsies, and his large half-focused eyes wept at the jolly pictures on the jarsies. He disliked his plastic dish made like a curled-up jolly kitten, and his spoon with the happy clown's head on the handle. He turned his face away determinedly, and began to pine, reducing his mother to tears and his father to frightened anger. The doctor said cheerily, "There's nothing the matter with him. He'll eat when he gets hungry enough." And Stephen did, to a degree, but not as if he enjoyed it. One day, when he was nearly a year old, his mother carried his kiddie corner with the dancing dogsies on the pad into her bedroom, put him in it, and began to take things out of the bottom bureau drawer. They were old things, and Harriet Russell was ashamed of them. She had said more than once to her husband Richard, only half joking, "I couldn't give them away, and I'd be ashamed for anybody to see them in our trash." They were old silver, knives and forks and spoons that looked like what they were, unadorned, and a child's plain silver dish and cup, and one small spoon with a useful curly handle. They had belonged to Harriet's great-grandmother. Once a year Harriet took the things out and polished them and furtively put them back. This year Stephen cried, "Ma!" stretching out his hands toward the silver and uttering a string of determined sounds which were perfectly clear to his mother. She smiled at him lovingly, but shook her head. "No, Stevie, Mumsy's precious baby doesn't want those nasty old things. No, he doesn't. Play with your happy clown, sweetheart." Stephen's face got red, and he squeezed his eyes shut, opened his mouth, and howled until his mother passed him the dish and cup and curly spoon to play with. At meal-time he would not be parted from them, and Harriet had to put away the plastic dish and spoon. Thereafter, for the sake of the container, he tolerated the thing contained, and thrived and grew fat. Stephen did not like his rockabye crib that joggled him gently and sang him songs about the happy clown all night long, and he howled until they turned it off. He was a clean boy, and to his mother's amazement trained himself to be dry day and night by the age of 14 months, without the aid of the singing toady or the happy clown alarm. So she bought him a little folks' youth bed, with a built-in joggler and happy clowns on the corners, and a television set in the footboard. It was a smaller copy of his parents' bed, even to the happy clowns. Stephen did not like that either, and if his parents persisted in turning the bed on after he had learned to turn it off, he climbed out and slept on the floor. Harriet said worriedly to her husband, "I don't know what could be the matter with him. Dickie, he's so peculiar." Richard tried to comfort her. "Never mind, Harry, he'll outgrow it." Stephen did not outgrow it. When he became too big for the curly spoon and dish and cup, he demanded a knife and fork and spoon from the bureau drawer and ate his meals from the plainest dish he could find. He ate them with his back stubbornly turned to the television set, away from the morning cartoons and the noontime kiddies' lunch club and the evening Happy Clown. The Happy Clown had been an American institution for 30 years. He was on television for an hour every night at dinner time, with puppets and movies and live singers and dancers and his own inimitable brand of philosophy and humor. Everybody loved the Happy Clown. He had been several different actors in 30 years, but his makeup never changed. The beaming face drawn in vivid colors, the rotund body that shook when he laughed like a bowlful of jelsies, and the chuckling infectious laugh. The Happy Clown was always so cheerful and folksy and sincere. He believed passionately in all the products he instructed his viewers to buy, and one was entirely certain that he used them all himself. He gave one much more than advertising, though. Some of his nightly gems of wisdom, he called them nuggets, were really wonderful. They made one think. A favorite nugget, which people were always writing in and asking him to repeat, went like this: "We're all alike inside, folks, and we ought to be all alike outside." The Happy Clown's viewers were not children and adults. They were kiddies and folks. After the Happy Clown went off the air, the happy kiddies went to bed to lie for a while looking at the jolly kitten and the dancing dogsy, until, lulled by the joggler, they went gently to sleep. After that came the cowboys and spacemen, carryovers for any happy kiddies with insomnia. For really meaty programs one had to stay up past 10. Then the spectaculars began, and the quiz shows, and the boxing and wrestling. Stephen did not like the Happy Clown, or the jolly kitten, or the dancing dogsy. Sometimes he began to grow interested in the cowboys or spacemen, but when they stopped in the middle of an adventure to talk about how they could not possibly rope the steers or shoot the asteroids without a good breakfast of cornsies and choco-milko, which everybody ate, just everybody, Stephen climbed out of bed and slept on the floor. Stephen did not like the records or the talking books, and when he went to kindergarten, he viewed the televised lessons with a cold eye. For some reason which he could not have explained, he wanted to learn to read, but they would not teach him till he was 7, and so he taught himself from the letters on the jerseys. But then there was nothing to read except the newspapers and the magazines, which he puzzled over patiently, getting most of the words right after a while. The many advertisements were easiest. They used pictures and the simplest of language. His parents thought it was very cunning of him to look at the printing like that, so wisely, as if he could read it. He said once to Harriet, "I can read it." But she said, "Oh, Stevie, you're teasing Mumsy," and looked so frightened at this fresh peculiarity that the child said gravely, "Yes, teasing." He wished he had a silent book. He knew there were such things, but there were none at home. There were few silent books anywhere. There were none in the kindergarten. Stephen was not happy in kindergarten. The enthusiasm the other kiddies showed for the lessons appalled him. The kiddies themselves appalled him. They joined so passionately in the group play, clutching each other with their hot, moist hands, panting and grinning into each other's faces. They were always clutching and panting and grinning in large, noisy groups with large community smiles. They confused him. He could not tell them apart. Stephen retired to a corner and turned his back, and when they clutched and panted and grinned at him, he hit them. The kindergarten monitor had to report of him to his unhappy parents that he was uncooperative and antisocial. He would not merge with the group. He would not acquire the proper attitudes for successful community living. He would not adjust. Most shocking of all, when the lesson about the birdsies and the beesies was telecast, he not only refused to participate in the ensuing period of group experimentation, but lost colour and disgraced himself for being sick in his corner. It was a painful interview. At the end of it, the monitor recommended the clinic. Richard appreciated her delicacy. The clinic would be less expensive than private psychiatry, and after all, the manager of a supermarket was no millionaire. Harriet said to Richard when they were alone, "Dickie, he isn't outgrowing it, he's getting worse. What are we going to do?" It was a special tragedy, since Harriet was unable to have any more kiddies, and if this one turned out wrong. Richard said firmly, "We'll take him to the clinic. They'll know what to do." The first thing they did to Stephen was to talk to him. The psychiatrist made him lie down on a foam rubber couch, kiddies model, with a happy clown motif on the slipcover, and said with a beaming face, "Now, Stevie, what seems to be the trouble?" The boy turned his head away from the psychiatrist's shining teeth and said, "My name's not Stevie, it's Stephen." He was a thin little boy, rather undersized. The baby fat had melted away fast when he began to be exposed to kindergarten. He had dark hair and big eyes, and an uncommonly precise way of speaking for a child of 5. The psychiatrist said, "Oh, but we're going to be friends, Stevie, and friends always use nicknames, don't they? My name's William, but everybody calls me Willie. You can call me Uncle Willie." The boy said, politely, "I'd rather not, please." The doctor was undismayed. "I want to help you. You believe that, don't you, Stevie?" The child said, "Stephen, do I have to lie down?" The doctor said agreeably, "It's more usual to lie down, but you may sit up if you want to. Why don't you like kindergarten, Stephen?" The boy sat up and regarded him warily. The doctor had a kind face, a really kind face, in spite of all those shining teeth, and Stephen was only 5 years old after all, and there was nobody to talk to, and he was desperately unhappy. "Perhaps," he said, "you'll tell them." The doctor shook his head. "Nothing goes farther than this room, Stephen." The child leaned forward, pressing his knees together, hugging himself with his arms, bowing his head. His position was almost fetal. He said, "I'm never by myself. They never let me be by myself." The psychiatrist said reasonably, "But nobody can live by himself, Stevie." He had apparently forgotten Stephen, and the boy did not correct him again. "You have to learn to live with other people, to work and play with them, to know them, and the only way you can learn is by being with them. When you can't be with them personally, there's always television. That's how you learn, Stevie. You can't be by yourself." The boy looked up and said starkly, "Never?" The gleaming teeth showed. "But why should you want to?" Stephen said, "I don't know." The doctor said, slowly and with emphasis, "Stevie, long before you were born, the world was a very bad place. There were wars all the time. Do you know why?" The boy shook his head. "It was because people were different from each other, and didn't understand each other, and didn't know each other. They had to learn how to be alike, and understand, and know, so that they would be able to live together. They learned in many ways, Stevie. One way was by visiting each other. You've heard about the visitors who come from. Stephen said, You mean the happy tours? Yes. When you're 12 years old, you can go on a happy tour. Won't that be fun? Stephen said, If I could go alone. The doctor looked at him sharply. But you can't. Try to understand, Stevie. You can't. Now tell me, why don't you like to be with other people? Stephen said, All the time. Not all the time. The doctor repeated patiently, Why? Stephen looked at the doctor and said a very strange thing. They touch me. He seemed to shrink into himself. Not just with their hands. The doctor shook his head sadly. Of course they do. That's just, well, maybe you're too young to understand. The interview went on for quite a while, and at the end of it Stephen was given a series of tests which took a week. The psychiatrist had not told the truth. What the boy said during the first interview and all the tests was fully recorded on concealed machines. The complete transcript made a fat dossier in the office of the clinic director. At the end of the tests, the director said seriously to Stevens's parents, I'll be frank with you. You have a brilliant kiddie here. Right now, he has the intelligence of a 12-year-old, but brilliance has to be channeled in the right direction. Just now, well, frankly, it's channeled in the wrong direction. We'll give it a year or so, and then if things don't clear up, I'm afraid we'll have to correct him. Richard said through dry lips. You mean a Stainer? The director nodded. The only thing. Harriet shuddered and began to cry. But there's never been anything like that in our family. The disgrace. Oh, Dickie, it would kill me. The director said kindly, There's no disgrace, Mrs. Russell. That's a mistaken idea many people have. These things happen occasionally. Nobody knows why, and there's absolutely no disgrace in a Stainer. Nothing is altered but the personality, and afterward you have a happy, normal kiddie who hardly remembers that anything was ever wrong with him. Naturally, nobody ever mentions it. But there's no hurry. In the case of a kiddie, we can wait a while. Bring Stevie in once a week. We'll try therapy first. Being, as the director had said, a brilliant kiddie, Stephen soon understood much of what was kept from him. It did not take him long to learn what was making his dadsy look stern and white, and what was making his mumsy cry. He loved his parents and did not want them to be unhappy, and he certainly did not want to have his head cut open, and so he began to act. Even at 5, Stephen discovered in himself a fine talent for acting. He began to conform, to adjust, to merge. He became social and cooperative and acquired the proper attitudes for successful community living. He gave up the old silver voluntarily. He accepted the youth bed. He looked at the happy clown, and he did much better in kindergarten. He even joined in the group experimentation and was not sick any more, though he could not keep himself from losing colour. They were pleased with him at the clinic, and after a few months discharged him. By the time Stephen was 12 and had made the happy tour and joined the happy scouts and had a happy affair involving experimentation with a neighbour's daughter, Harriet and Richard ceased to worry about him. If sometimes he felt so tightly strung up that a storm of tears was his only relief, he kept the tears quiet. He was graduated from high school at 16 and from college at 20, having read all he could of the silent books in the scant high school library and the more ample university one, and having wisely elected to appear more stupid than he was. Even his IQ was now judged to be only slightly above normal. He left college with honours, popularity, and a reputation as an actor. He took the lead in all the dramatic club plays, having particular success in the reproduction of a happy clown program. Stephen, of course, was the happy clown. He enrolled at once in the New York School of Television Arts, and his mother cried when he left home to live in the school dormitory. Stephen did well at television arts, soon taking more leads than was customary in school productions, which were organized on a strictly repertory basis. He did not stay to graduate, being snatched away in his first year by a talent scout for a popular daytime serial, The Happy Life. The Happy Life recounted the trials of a young physician, too beautiful for his own good, who became involved in endless romantic complications. Stephen was given the lead, the preceding actor having moved up to a job as understudy for the Jolly Kitten, and was an immediate success. For one thing, he looked the part. He was singularly handsome in a lean, dark-browed way, and did not need flattering makeup or special camera angles. He had a deep, vibrant voice and perfect timing. He could say, "Darling, this is tearing me to pieces," with precisely the right intonation, and let tears come into his magnificent eyes and make his jaw muscles jump appealingly, and hold the pose easily for the 5 minutes between the 10-minute pitch for Marquis cigarettes, which constituted one episode of The Happy Life. His fan mail was prodigious. If Stephen had moments of bewilderment, of self-loathing, of despair, when the tears were real and the jaw muscles jumped to keep the mouth from screaming, no one in the happy young men's dormitory where he slept ever knew it. He managed his life well enough. He had a few affairs with girls. It was expected of one, and he did not have to work very hard at it, since they always threw themselves at him. And he got along well with other young men, who forgave him for being so handsome, because he did not work at it, except on camera. But he was lonely. Surrounded by people, intruded and trespassed upon, continually touched in ways other than physical, he was yet lonely. During his life he had met a few other nonconformists, shy, like him, wary of revealing themselves, but something always seemed to happen to them. Some were miserable, being nonconformists, and asked pitifully for the stainer. Some were detected, as Stephen had been, and some were unfortunately surprised in hospitals. Under the anesthetic they sometimes talked, and then, if they were adults, they were immediately corrected by means of Stainer's lobotomy. It had been learned that adults did not respond to therapy. There was never any organization, any underground of misfits. An underground presupposes injustice to be fought, cruelty to be resisted, and there was no injustice and no cruelty. The mass of people were kind, and their leaders, duly and fairly elected, were kind. They all sincerely believed in the gospel of efficiency and conformity and kindness. It had made the world a wonderful place to live in, full of wonderful things to make and buy and consume, all wonderfully advertised. And if one were a misfit, and the doctors found it out, and gave one a stainer, it was only to make one happy, so that one could appreciate what a wonderful world it was. Stephen met no nonconformists at the School of Television Arts, and none while he was acting in The Happy Life, until Denise Cottrell joined the cast. Denise, called Denny, of course, was a pleasantly plain young woman with a whimsical face which photographed pretty and remarkable dark blue eyes. It was her eyes which first made Stephen wonder. They mirrored his own hope and longing and the desperate loneliness of the exile. For 2 months they were together as often as they could be, talking intellectual treason in public under cover of conventional faces, and talking intellectual treason in private with excitement and laughter and sometimes tears, falling in love. They planned, after much discussion, to be married and to bring up a dozen clever rebel children. Denise said soberly, They'd better be clever, because they'll have to learn to hide. They made love in Denise's apartment when her roommate Polly, was out, as awkwardly as if there had never been any group experimentation or happy affairs. Denise said wonderingly, "When you really love someone, it's all new. Isn't that strange?" And Stephen said, kissing her, "No, not strange at all." He took her to meet his family. Denise's family lived 3,000 miles away, and she behaved with such perfect decorum and charm that Richard and Harriet were delighted and as eager as Stephen for the wedding. Stephen had agreed reluctantly to put it off until Denise had a chance to introduce him to her parents. They were coming east at Christmas. She laughed over it and said, "I'm being terribly conventional, darling, but that's one convention I like." While they waited, Stephen's agent secured a really unprecedented opportunity for so young and relatively untried an actor. The current happy clown was unhappily retiring by reason of age and infirmity, and Stephen's agent arranged a tryout for the part. He said, "Give it all you got, kid. It's the chance of the century." Stephen said, "Sure, Joey," and allowed his sensitive face to register all the proper emotions. Actually, his emotions were, in the vernacular of a previous century, mixed. He loathed the whole concept of the happy clown, but there was money in it, and Stephen was not rebel enough to despise money. With money he could retire early, go away somewhere with Denise, to some country place where they could be relatively free of pressure. Over staggering competition, he got the part. He called Denise up at once from a booth at the studio to tell her. Polly answered the phone, looking pale and frightened over the viewer, and said rapidly, "Oh, Stevie, I've been trying to get you for an hour. Denny's sick. They took her to the hospital." Stephen sat back against the hard wall of the booth, feeling cold, the receiver slack in his hand. He said, "What's the matter with her? Which hospital?" "Appendicitis. Happy hour." Polly began to cry. "Oh, Stevie, I feel so—" "I'll go right over." He cut her off abruptly and went. The doctors caught Denise's appendix in time to avoid the necessary but rarely fatal complications. But under the anesthetic she talked, revealing enough about her opinion of television and the happy clown cult and the state of society in general, to cause the doctors to raise their eyebrows pityingly and perform the stainer at once. While Stephen sat unknowing in the waiting room, smoking a full pack of Marquis cigarettes, the thing was done. At last the doctor came out to him and said what was always said in such cases. "It was necessary to do something, you understand, no mention." And for a moment Stephen felt so ill that he was grateful for the little ampule the doctor broke and held under his nose. They always carried those when they have to give news of a stainer to relatives or sweethearts or friends. The doctor said, "All right now? Good. You'll be careful, of course. She may be conscious for a minute. There's no harm in it yet. She won't move or touch the—" Stephen said, "I'll be careful." He was still feeling ill when they let him in to see Denise. He sat down beside her bed and spoke to her urgently. "Denise, talk to me, please, Denise." She opened her eyes, looked at him drowsily and smiled. "Oh, Stevie, I'm so glad you came. I've been wanting you, darling." Stephen said, "Denise." She frowned. "Why do you call me that? Call me Denny. Did you get the part, darling?" He drew back a little. "Yes, I got it." She gave him a radiant smile. "That's wonderful. I'm so proud of you, Stevie." She slept again. That night, in the HYM dormitory, Stephen did not sleep. He lay quiet, tense, hoping for the relief of tears, but it did not come. Stephen went to see Denise every day, though after the first time she was not awake to know him. The doctors were keeping her under sedation until the head bandage could be removed. So far as Denise was to know, she had gone to the hospital simply for a rather protracted appendectomy. Looking at her, Stephen knew that he could never leave her. He had loved her completely. He would love her now with as much of himself as she would need or understand. For a while he waited to be kindly questioned, to be thoroughly examined, to be tenderly given the shot in the arm, and to awake like her. But nobody came. Denise had apparently said nothing about him. Some censor or other, perhaps it was the censor of love, had kept her from even saying his name. For a while Stephen considered confessing to somebody that he was an unacceptable member of society. Then they would make him like Denise. He shuddered. Did he really want to be like Denise? Some stubborn pride in him refused it. When Denise left the hospital for the hotel where she would stay until the wedding, Stephen was more gentle with her than ever, kinder and more loving. He made her very happy. He made love to her again, and it was like loving a ghost. No, it was like loving a fine, beautiful body without the ghost, without the spirit. He returned to the HYM to lie sleepless amid the breathings and mutterings of the other young men, turning restlessly in his bed, feeling oppressed, tormented, strung on wires. He rehearsed feverishly for the part of the happy clown, and because he was a fine craftsman and a conscientious artist, he continued to give it all he had. The sponsors were pleased. A week before Christmas, the current happy clown retired and hobbled off to a nursing home. There was no fanfare. The public was not to realize that the happy clown was mortal, and Stephen took over with no visible change. For 5 days he played the part to perfection. On the 6th day he performed as usual, perhaps a little better. His commercials had a special fervour, and the sponsors exchanged happy glances. Denise was sitting in the booth with them. She smiled at Stephen lovingly through the glass. Stephen was running a little fast tonight. The engineer made stretching motions with his hands to slow him down, but he used up all his material, even the nugget, with 3 minutes to spare. Then he said, "All right, folks, now I have a special treat for you," and moved quickly to the center mic. Before the sponsors, or the engineers, or the studio audience, or anybody in the whole American nation knew what was happening, he began rapidly to talk. He said, "Are you all happy? You are, aren't you? Everybody's happy, because you're all sheep in a nice, safe pasture, all alike. You eat alike and dress alike and think alike. If any of you has an original thought, you'd better suppress it, or they'll cut it out of you with a knife." He leaned forward and made a horrible face at the camera. Under the jolly make-up and the artful padding, his mouth was shockingly twisted, and tears were running out of his eyes. "A long, sharp knife, folks." He paused momentarily to recover his voice, which had begun to shake. "Go on being happy. Go on being sheep. Wear the clothesies and eat the foodsies, and don't dare think. Me, I'd rather be dead and damned and in hell." Fortunately, nobody heard the last 3 sentences. The paralyzed engineer had recovered in time to cut him off during the pause, and had signalled the stagehand to draw the curtain and the soundman to play the Happy Clown sign-off record loud. Stephen finished himself thoroughly, however, by repeating the same sentiments, with some others he happened to think of, to Denise and the sponsors when they all came pouring out of the booth. Then he collapsed. Stephen Stainer was a complete success. He recovered from it a subdued, agreeable, and thoroughly conventional young man, who had the impression that he had suffered a nervous breakdown. He was discharged from the happy hour at the end of January, innocently leaving behind him the broken hearts of 3 nurses and 1 female physician, and went home to his parents. During his convalescence, they were patient with him and passionately kind. In spite of the disgrace they felt, a disgrace that would never be mentioned, they loved him even better than before, because now he was irrevocably like them. Denise was lost to him. The outburst in the studio, and the Stainer, and the loss of the happy clown part were cumulatively too much for her. She broke the engagement and was heard to say that Stevie Russell had proved himself an absolute fool. He was miserable over it, though he had only a hazy idea of what he had done or why Denny should suddenly be so unkind to him. The happy clown incident had passed off well. Immediately after it occurred, a powerful battery of comedians, including the Jolly Kitten and the Dancing Dogsy, forgetting rivalries to rally round in a crisis, went on the air to ensure that it passed off well. They made certain that every viewer should regard the whole thing as a tremendously funny, if rather mystifying, joke. The viewers fell in with this opinion easily, and laughed about the sheep joke a good deal, admiring the happy clown's sense of humour, a little sharp, to be sure, not so folksy and down-to-earth as usual, but the happy clown could do no wrong. They said to each other, "He laughed till he cried, did you notice? So did I." For a while teenagers addressed each other as, "Hi, sheep!" Girls were, "Hi, lamb!" And a novelty company in Des Moines made a quick killing with scatterpins fashioned like sheep and or lambs. But around the studios, Stephen was dead. Stainer or no Stainer, and of course that part of it was never openly discussed. Sponsors had long memories, and the consensus seemed to be that it was best to let sleeping sheep lie. Stephen did not care. He no longer had any particular desire to be an actor. Stephen went to work in his father's supermarket, and was happy among the shelves of Oatsies and Cornsies and Gelsies. He got over Denise after a while, and met a girl named Frances, Franny, whom he loved and who loved him. They were married in the summer, and had a little house with as much furniture in it as they could afford. The first thing they bought was a television set. After all, as Stevie said, he would not want to miss the happy clown. The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. I, Executioner, by Ted White and Terry Carr. Originally published in If, Worlds of Science Fiction, March 1963. Narrated by Tom Trussel. I always shook when I came out of the arena, but this time the tension wrapped my stomach in painful knots, and salty perspiration stung my neck where I had shaved only a little over an hour earlier. And despite the heavy knot in my stomach, I felt strangely empty. I had never been able to sort out my reactions to an execution. The atmosphere of careful boredom, the strictly business-as-usual air failed to dull my senses as it did for the others. I could always taste the ozone in the air, mixed with a taste of fear. Whether mine or that of the condemned, I never knew. My nostrils always gave an involuntary twitch at the confined odours, and I felt an almost claustrophobic fear at being packed into the arena with the other 999 citizens on execution duty. I had been expecting my notice for several months before it finally came. I hadn't served execution duty for nearly 2 years. Usually it had figured out to every 14 months or so on rotation, so I'd been ready for it. A little apprehensive, I always am, but ready. At 9 sharp in the morning, still only half awake, I'd purposely slept till the last minute, vaguely trying to remember the dream I'd had. I waited in front of the arena for the ordeal to begin. The dream had been something about a knife, an operation, but I couldn't remember whether I'd been the doctor or the patient. Our times of arrival had been staggered in our notices so that a long queue wouldn't tie up traffic, but as usual the checkers were slow and we were backed up a bit. I didn't like waiting. Somehow I've always felt more exposed on the streets, although the brain scanners must be more plentiful in an arena than almost anywhere else. It's only logical that they should be. The scanners are set up to detect unusual patterns of stress in our brain waves as we pass close to them, and thus to pick out as quickly as possible those with incipient or developing neuroses or psychoses. The potential deviates. And where else would such an aberration be as likely to come out as in the arena? I had moved to the front of the short line. I flashed my notification of duty to the checker and was waved on in. I found my proper seat on the aisle in the tea section. It was a relief to sink into its plush depths and look the arena over. Once this has been a first-run Broadway theatre, first a place where great plays were shown, then later the more degenerate motion pictures. Those had been times of vicarious escape from reality, times when the populace ruled, and yet the masses hid their eyes from the world. Many things had changed since then, with the coming of regulated sanity and the achievement of world peace. Gone now were the black arts of forgetfulness, those media which practiced the enticement of the citizen into irresponsible escape. Now this crowded theatre was only a reminder, and a place of execution for those who would have sought escape here. Perhaps 30 people were sitting on the floor of the arena, where once there had been a stage. They sat quietly in chairs not so different from mine, strapped for the moment into a kind of passive conformity. I looked at them with interest. Strangeness has as much attraction as the familiar at times. As usual, most of them were young, from about 10 to the early 20s. But at whatever age, they were rebels. They were potential enemies of society, criminals. Probably some of them hadn't yet realized it, but they were on the verge of antisocial insanity, and the brain scanners had singled them out. They were so young. How long does it take a boy to become neurotic, psychotic, dangerous? A flurry of movement at the gates caught my eye. Apparently at least one of them was a full-fledged rebel. He struggled furiously, and the 3 proctors were having an awkward time carrying him into the arena without hurting him. Then, as they moved into the floodlights, I saw with a faint shock that it was a girl. She was dressed in man's clothing, but betrayed by her neurotic and unsanitary long hair. Long, blonde hair. For a moment I forgot where I was, and allowed myself to revel in this nearly forbidden sight. The soft waves fell halfway down her neck, disarrayed now. The floodlights shined on it, a strangely gentle mockery of sunlight. Something within me stirred, and I almost remembered. Then they were strapping her into one of the chairs, carefully pulling the soft leather straps with their attached metal electrodes around her, pinioning her. One set joined her arms to the armrests, another her legs to the specially devised footrests. Her tunic was opened, and a third set was passed around her chest, the metal plate fastened just under her left breast. And then she was alone. I stared at her, drawn at first to her hair, and then, as my vision focused across the distance, to her eyes. Strange eyes, light blue irises surrounded by a ring of dark blue and flecked with gold. They were shining. She had been crying. Her eyes seemed to melt, like a pool of clear water growing deeper. I could almost see into them, into the darkness beneath. I was no longer aware of the chair in which I sat, only of her, alone before me, so close. Her eyes widened for just an instant when she recognized me. "Bob." "Hello, Rosebud." "I knew you'd be here. I knew." "It's been a long time. I think I was trying to forget." "Don't," she said. "Don't ever forget." Sun drenched me, and I was rocked back into time. "Hey, you pushed me!" I shouted at her. "Yes," said a faint voice, and then, "I'm sorry," the little golden-haired girl said. I sat up. Mother was going to be mad at me again, I knew. I wiped the seat of my pants with my hand, and then stared at the muddy hand with interest. "Look," I said to her, and showed her my hand. When she stepped forward to look closely at it, I pushed it at her and smeared mud onto her face. Then I laughed. My laughter faded, blending with hers, and then we were no longer standing separately in the sun. It was a dark night, the air fresh and cool to my skin, and the leaves of the trees which stretched over us rustled with a faint wind. I laughed again, a soft girlish sound that brought discomfort to the boy's face before me. "Your mother says, your father says. Don't you ever say anything for yourself, Bob?" "Look, Rosalie, I'm sorry. Maybe I just don't think the way you do. My father says sex at our age is just another escape from reality. You've got to face yourself as an adult first. "Your father is a bigger nincompoop than you are," I shouted at him. "I thought you said you loved me. I thought you had some feelings buried under that so-called rational mind of yours. Or does your father say you're too young to love somebody?" He tried to say something, but I was right. He pressed his lips together and looked away. I was almost enjoying it now. With deliberate coolness I buttoned up my tunic, feeling the soft fibres on my skin. "How long does it take to love somebody?" I said, but my voice was beginning to tremble. I turned away from his still figure in the night and began the slow walk back along the path to the house. Tears stung my eyes and spilled onto my cheeks. I started to run through the dark. I slammed the door when I ran in and went directly to my room. At one end of it was a small studio where an easel was lit coldly by a fluorescent light. Almost blindly I began beating my fists on the still wet canvas, blurring and then ripping the nearly finished portrait of a young man. I was crying quietly when the low, calm voice stopped me on the street. "Just a moment, miss." I felt the sudden skip in my heart which signalled danger, and when I turned I saw the light green uniform of a proctor in the vague street light. My eyes were still blurred with tears. I couldn't make out his face. "I'm sorry, but I'll have to ask you a few questions." Shielding my face from the light, I tried to make my voice calm. I hoped my homesick tears were hidden, that my cheeks wouldn't glisten in the light. I wanted very badly for him not to see I had been crying. "Yes?" "I'll have to know why you're out on the streets at this time of the morning," the proctor said. "There's a curfew, you know, unless you can show cause." Oh God, I had completely forgotten the city's curfew. I'm sorry, officer. I'm new to the city and I didn't realize." "You're transient. Where are you staying?" "The Statler Dormitory for Women," I answered meekly. "And why are you out at this hour so far from the dorm? That's down near 34th Street, almost 30 blocks south." "I know. I couldn't sleep." His eyes narrowed at that. Had I made a mistake? I plunged on. "And I wanted to see Central Park. I didn't realize there was any harm." "I guess not this time, miss. But you'd better get back to your dorm. Take this pass." He scribbled a few words on a pad and then detached a slip of green paper for me. "You can take a train down to 34th Street. Now."
"I'd just as soon walk, sir." He stared at me for a moment, and then I turned and started for the nearest subway entrance. It had been horrible, those first few days in the dorm. I'd never dreamed that a sane society could be so, not cruel, but unthinking. Back home in Woodstock we were all supposed to be sane too, but neither father nor mother had ever forced any rigid rules on me. They had let me roam the woods, scuffing the dry leaves in autumn, drinking water from the creeks in my cupped hands. They hadn't objected when I was gone for hours. Usually I was just sitting on a log and staring into the sky, and what harm was there in that? They had encouraged my painting.
"It's supposed to be a sign of escapism," Dad said, "but there are a lot worse ways of escaping."
He made an easel for me, and I used tubes of house paint, tint colours, and stretched canvas and burlap over frames Dad made. He even gave me a book of reproductions of the old masters that he'd saved. Life in Woodstock had been pleasant for me, I realized now, even if it had often seemed lonely. I couldn't have told the proctor that I'd really woken up from a dream about Bob before I'd gone out walking. I'd seen Bob's face so clearly, standing in the night, unable to say anything to me. Suddenly it had seemed that my voice was stopped too, and I'd woken up, gasping. I boarded a local train, not caring that an express would be much faster, and began the trip back to my cubicle at the Statler dorm. If only they hadn't taken my parents. I had succeeded in setting up a makeshift easel in my room at the dorm, and was working on a painting, wearing some of Dad's old clothes, when the proctors broke in. One of them pointed a small indicator at me, glanced at it, and nodded.
"She's the one. Instability and escapism. And look at the kind of clothes she wears."
"What are you doing?" I whispered. "This was how they'd taken my parents."
"You're under detention as a criminal against society, miss,"
one of the proctors said.
"We're all sorry."
Another one stepped forward and held out a hand to me as one might a child.
"Come along now."
"No!" I backed away from them, and when they trapped me in the corner, I kicked and screamed at them. "Leave me alone! Leave me alone! You're killers!" One of them grabbed me and held me around my waist, my arms pinned to my sides. "We're not killers, miss," he said, and his voice was incredibly calm.
"We have nothing to do with it."
I twisted free and struck at him, tearing skin from his face with my nails. "Weren't my parents enough?" One of them pointed another device at me, and I blacked out. When I came to, I was being carried by 3 proctors through a door and down a hall. My head was fuzzy and throbbing. I caught a glimpse of a stenciled sign in the corridor, lettered neatly over an arrow pointing in the direction we were going. The words leaped out at me. "Execution Arena Floor." One of the proctors saw that I was conscious and looked down at me pleasantly. "No sense struggling now," he said. "It'll be over soon." I stared back at him for a moment, not understanding. But then the kindness on his face became clear. He pitied me. The proctors were carrying me as gently as possible, as though I were a dog with a broken leg. I felt incredibly sad, and so tired that I was sure I must suddenly weigh twice as much. But they carried me through the door and out onto the floor of the arena, and there were 1,000 people up in the dark waiting for me. There were floodlights on the chairs where the others of the condemned were strapped. They sat, quietly, dully, as though they were the executioners and the people above them waiting for them to press the buttons. But it was insane. How could they take it so calmly? Were they dead already? Did they want to die? Or was I really insane? Where was the sanity in this arena? I couldn't lie still while they carried me to that chair. I was frightened. I was terrified. They were all so silent, so calm, so kindly. as though nothing at all were happening. Nothing at all. I struggled, trying to fight my way free. I kicked and screamed. I had to make some noise in that black silence. But they held me and strapped me into the chair, and still there was no sound in the arena. I felt a shock, a tension, and I looked up. There, in the audience, sitting before his little panel with a blue light and the red executioner's button, was a young man staring at me. I could feel his stare, like a cool hand touching me. It drew me up into the dimness. I felt my eyes widen with recognition. "Bob," I said. His reply sounded deep inside my mind. "Hello, Rosebud." "I knew you'd be here," I said, and then I drew him close to me. "It's been a long time." "Don't ever forget," I said, and opened myself to him at last. The lights in the arena dimmed, rose, dimmed again. The first signal I pressed against the straps, but they were firm and unmoving. Yet we, leaned forward and watched the panel with its blue light. Our stomach was knotted like tight leather cords. The blue light flashed. I reached out a hand to the small red button. The straps bit into our flesh. The panel was dim, ghostly beneath the glaring lights from the dark above. 1,000 hands touched 1,000 red buttons. One of them was the first to touch the button, the first to complete the circuit. No one knew who he was. No one even knew if every button was connected, but someone touched a button, and somewhere the circuit was completed. Shock! Pain jerked our body rigid. We screamed. Our skin blistered as hair singed and fell away. And there was a greater shock, a pain somewhere else, as our images cleaved and I fell away from her. I reached out my hand to her, and almost felt her touch. But my hand was on the button, and she was slumped in her chair on the floor of the arena. I jerked my hand away from the button as though it were hot electricity. My whole body was moist with perspiration. I stared about me, suddenly and deeply frightened. Which of us had screamed? I felt it surging up in me, felt it tearing at my throat, bursting from my mouth. But next to me the others were unconcernedly waiting for me to rise from my seat so that we could file in an orderly fashion from our places in the arena. They had noticed nothing. When I stood up, my legs were trembling. I could still feel where the leather straps had bitten into them. I stepped carefully up the stairs and went out into the morning sunshine. Though the floodlights had been bright in the arena, still the sunlight hurt my eyes. I paused at the door and looked at my ring watch. It was 9:30. Only half an hour had passed. How long does it take to destroy a few spoiled lives? It was over. I forced my breathing into a more normal rate and stepped onto the sidewalk. Don't think about it, I told myself. After all, it had been years earlier that I had really lost her. I had almost made it to the corner when I felt the tap on my shoulder, began to turn, saw the green-sleeved arm extending toward me, a familiar black indicator, and heard the proctor say, "This is the one. Definite case, schizoid condition, latent telepath." "We're all sorry," said another of them. And they led me away to face it again.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. If you are not subscribed, why ever not? It's free.